Welcome to the debate. Today, we're diving into something pretty fundamental, that critical barrier to achievement, the struggle for personal consistency. Our source material makes this really insightful and, frankly, kind of painful observation that the usual roadmap, the steps like setting clear goals, creating routines, prioritizing, well, it says that's sadly not enough.
Right. And that gap, that inability to turn what we know into sustained action, that's really the core dilemma here, isn't it? If the steps are clear, if the plan is laid out in front of you, why do people get stuck? What's missing? What's that fundamental piece that just stops things cold?
Exactly. Which suggests the failure isn't just about, poor organization or something superficial. It's deeper. So, the central question for us today, and this comes straight from the material, is whether getting that long-term consistency, that success, is it mainly about an internal psychological shift, tackling fear, ego, self-worth, or is it more about mastering the external stuff, the behavioral strategies, the systems?
And I'm going to argue that, focusing too much on those deep internal battles can actually be counterproductive, a bit exhausting, really. I think success hinges more on mastering those pragmatic behavioral strategies, building a kind of practical normalcy around what you want to achieve, and just focusing relentlessly on the consistent doing.
I see why you'd prioritize the action, the doing. But my argument is that consistent action, it just can't be sustained unless that internal resistance is dealt with first. I really believe true consistency comes from that internal shift, overcoming the mental blocks, claiming your own personal worthiness, taking responsibility for your gifts, whatever they are. You have to sort of solidify that foundation before any external system can really hold up under pressure.
Okay, let's lay out those positions a bit more clearly then.
All right. So my position is this. If the roadmap is there and you still don't act, the fundamental hurdle is, it's an internal blockage within the mind. The material says all you need now is the willpower to do so, but let's be honest, willpower runs out. The real issue, I think, is that the individual is sort of actively rejecting the consistent version of themselves. And this rejection, it's rooted in fear and ego. Fear of showing up differently, but also that deep fear of not being good at this future thing you're aiming for. That potential failure feels like, quote, a bruise to my ego. So consistency demands this, radical reevaluation of worth. You have to, and this is from the text, deem yourself worthy enough to have an expectation of something great within yourself. That commitment, that's the real sacrifice. Not just time, but sacrificing emotional comfort, the safety of mediocrity. The discipline, then, is based on saying, I preserve 100% of my excellence for me and my endeavors. I am worthy of my own 100%.
That pursuit of radical worthiness, it's definitely a powerful idea. But look, I come at this from a slightly different angle. While I absolutely recognize psychological barriers are real, I think putting all the emphasis on this continuous grand internal struggle, like fighting your ego every day, resolving deep-seated self-worth issues constantly, often that just sets people up for self-sabotage. The material itself points out that people throw it to the ground in frustration at the first mistake, like a child. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a failure of self-worth at its core. It's often a failure of strategy, of managing expectations, maybe stemming from what the text calls an emotional entitlement to the work. So for me, the real path to sustainable action lies in strategy and creating a behavioral normalcy, making the desired output just normal. Consistency isn't about flexing willpower constantly. It's about reducing friction, making it easier to do the thing than not do it. And you achieve that through constant doing, yes, but also by shaping your environment so the goal is always present. The speaker in our source material talks about obsessing over being a creator by immersing themselves, watching and listening to full-time creators. That made the goal feel less like something above me, but something around me. It's about using systems to basically eliminate the opportunity for procrastination, making sure those thoughts of doubt just don't find a place to land.
That's an interesting point about the environment, definitely. Though I might frame it a bit differently. The environmental control, it only really works when the internal gatekeeper, the ego, has been, well, disarmed or sidelined. Which brings us, I think, to our first core point of debate. How effective is it to actively confront and neutralize the ego versus just building a system of normalcy around it? My argument is the ego must be actively managed. It craves control, it likes knowing the outcome, and it prevents new growth. It'll make you stop the moment you get a little bit of gratification. When the material says the ego stands in the way of God doing a new thing in us, I take that to mean it resists the uncertainty that's essential for any real transformation. So the solution proposed is active. Put my ego in the back room to fold clothes. It's a great metaphor, right? It implies distracting that critical, controlling part of the mind with something routine, low stakes, basically stripping it of its power over the important, uncertain stuff.
I'm sorry, but I struggle with the idea that the path to consistency has to involve this perpetual active psychological warfare. That sounds inherently exhausting, fundamentally unsustainable when life throws stress or fatigue at you, which it inevitably does. The moment you let your inner guard down, that ego you banished to the back room is going to step right back up front, isn't it? I think a more robust, maybe more strategic approach is to reduce the ego's influence by limiting friction and designing your environment. If you spend, as the text says, all day listening to people who have mastered things, you start to redefine what feels normal, what feels achievable. The starting point doesn't seem so hard. So behavioral normalcy kind of manages the ego almost by starvation, not direct combat. By making the consistent action automatic, expected, just part of the furniture, you minimize the mental challenge, and therefore you minimize the space the ego needs to jump in and demand comfort or control. The strategic goal isn't necessarily to defeat the ego, but maybe just to make its resistance irrelevant.
But even your highly optimized systems, your behavioral setups, they still need an initial commitment, right? And a sustained one. And that commitment, I argue, it has to be rooted in something deeper than just smooth mechanics. Which leads us to our second point. What's the driving force behind consistency? I believe sustainability requires that sense of profound responsibility, of purpose. It leads to what the text calls a military-like mindset. It's driven by knowing you're in service for others, that you're responsible for your gifts, and not acting on them becomes a disservice to my spirit. Even more, the material frames consistency as a kind of rebellion to the forces that be, a pushback against societal systems that maybe funnel contribution into more traditional, quantifiable paths like science or numbers. This deep, almost spiritual obligation to use your unique talent. I think that's the only thing that really sustains effort when the strategies get tough or the work just feels tedious.
I think that's the only thing that really sustains effort. When the strategies get tough or the work just feels tedious. That's definitely a compelling case for the ultimate why, perhaps. But relying solely on these, let's say, heroic concepts like rebellion or a divine mission, doesn't that sometimes obscure the simpler, more pragmatic drivers that are needed just to get started and build that initial consistency? When the purpose feels overwhelmingly grand, it can actually be paralyzing. That pressure of a military mindset could stop someone completely before they even began. I noticed the source material also points to simpler, maybe more reliable engines for action. Things like curiosity about a different life, maybe one where you get paid for being authentic. Or just the practical pressure of being truly bored or dissatisfied with how things are right now. Boredom, curiosity. These are pretty low-stakes, reliable drivers for just initiating action and building those first systems. Maybe the focus should be more on the practical, tangible future outcome, like the speaker did, emphasizing I said when and not if about success. That feels more grounded, perhaps, than the immense weight of a huge mission, which, might just delay the basic foundational steps.
I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning because it seems to treat the doing as separate from the deep reason for doing it. If you're only driven by curiosity or dissatisfaction, what happens when the work inevitably becomes hard, repetitive, maybe even profoundly boring? That commitment tied to radical responsibility, that feeling that it would be a disservice to myself to know all of the talent that I have and not fight for it, That's the internal lever, I think, that carries you through those plateaus when curiosity naturally wanes. That underlying commitment is what prevents the psychological snap, the self-sabotage, when real difficulty kicks in.
Okay, and that moves us perfectly into our third key point, the actual mechanism of self-sabotage. We seem to agree that stopping is the failure mode, but why people stop, or rather how to prevent it, that's where we diverge. You're linking stopping to a breakdown in internal worthiness. I'm linking it more to a failure of immediate behavioral correction of strategy. The material notes that self-sabotage often looks like throwing things away in frustration when the first mistake happens, fueled by that fear of incompetence.
Yes, exactly. And that frustration, I argue, is rooted in the fear that any imperfection invalidates the whole effort, maybe even invalidates the self. The commitment to true worthiness requires something much more radical, facing the absolute uncertainty that some of your missions will not be 100% successful, but knowing deep down that this doesn't negate your right, your worthiness, to pursue them anyway. That internal resolution about your right to strive for greatness, I think that has to come before the action can be truly sustained.
That's a powerful psychological state to achieve, absolutely. But let's look at the practical mechanism for avoiding the collapse right when it happens. The solution, I think, lies less in a single grand moment of internal resolution and more in concrete strategies for immediate iteration. The speaker emphasizes this. I tweak, there's things and ways that I try to make things better, but I never stop myself from the doing, right? It's that ability to consistently iterate, to have a behavioral feedback loop that's critical. This constant motion, this relentless doing, it eliminates the enemy procrastination, and it prevents those thoughts of doubt from lingering long enough to actually trigger quitting. It's about continuous behavioral reinforcement, which feels, well, frankly, far more reliable day to day than waiting for or relying on a big psychological breakthrough.
But isn't the decision to tweak instead of quit, isn't that inherently a psychological decision? Doesn't it stem from that prior acceptance of responsibility you mentioned? If I haven't truly claimed, as the text says, my 100% excellence for myself, then won't the first major setback just feel like proof I shouldn't be doing this, confirming the ego's narrative that I'm out of my depth? Strategy, I think, is only truly sustainable once the mind is quiet at its core internal resistance.
Or maybe the strategy is the primary way you manage that resistance, by creating a compelling environment, by using those pragmatic, immediate drivers, boredom, dissatisfaction, curiosity. You effectively sidestep the ego's constant need for control. You essentially make the path of least resistance the path of consistency itself. And maybe that renders the need for that continuous, strenuous internal commitment, well, less critical, perhaps even moot for getting started and staying in motion.
We definitely seem to disagree on the order of operations here, even if we value the same outcome, sustained, meaningful action. So to summarize my position, for anyone who knows the how, they have the logistics, the routine ideas, the goals, but still can't maintain consistency. The blockage is likely a foundational identity issue. Until you accept that radical responsibility for your talents, fight for your gifts, and actively manage the ego, maybe put it on low-stakes duty, while external strategies alone are likely to lead only to repeated frustration. You have to resolve the worthiness issue, I believe, before you can truly commit to sacrificing immediate comfort for long-term growth.
And I'll maintain that while sure, internal alignment is definitely helpful, the most pragmatic and probably reliable path to consistency lies in focusing on the daily systems, changing your environment to create that behavioral normalcy, using tangible, manageable drivers like curiosity and just plain dissatisfaction to keep moving forward. That constant, iterative doing is what crowds out doubt and minimizes the need for these continuous, frankly exhausting, internal battles against the self. You build resilience by prioritizing the action, the behavior itself.
Absolutely, yeah. Ultimately, the listener needs to assess where their primary blockage really lies. Does it require that deeper internal work, confronting fear, establishing worth, or is it more about needing a disciplined, maybe almost inescapable behavioral system to just force that initial critical momentum? The source material itself suggests it's the interplay, doesn't it, between that deep purpose and practical everyday action. That's probably where true consistency actually lives.